The first letter arrived on the morning after the wedding. It was not a long letter. Ruth had written it at the dressing table in the bedchamber she'd been given, a room that smelled of beeswax and dried lavender and someone else's life, while the house settled into its late-night silence around her. She had used a single sheet of her own paper, brought from home, and her own ink, because she had not yet learned where the household kept its supplies. The handwriting was steady. She had always had a steady hand. Your Grace, I hope you slept well. The rooms are beautiful, and I am grateful. I noticed the garden from the east window this morning, and wondered whether the roses are yours or were planted by a previous occupant. I should like to walk there, if it is permitted. She had signed it with her full name, Ruth Sefton. Then crossed it out and written Ruth Draycott, because that was who she was now, though the ink looked strange above a surname she had never practiced. She left it on the silver tray outside his study, where his correspondence was placed each morning by Penny, his valet, a man of perhaps 50, with hands that moved like a surgeon's and a face that gave away nothing. Penny saw the letter. He placed it with the others. He said nothing. Lawrence Draycott, 6th Duke of Halston, read the letter at 8:30, standing at the window of his study with a cup of tea going cold on the mantelpiece. He read it once. His expression did not change. He folded it precisely along its original crease and held it to the candle on his desk. The paper caught quickly. He held it until the flame reached his fingers, then dropped it into the grate. Penny, who had entered to lay out the Duke's riding coat, watched the small curl of ash settle against the iron. He said nothing, but he noticed the way the Duke's hand remained at his side for a moment afterward, the fingers slightly curled, as though they had held something heavier than a single sheet of paper. That evening, Penny swept the grate in the study himself, though it was not his duty. He collected the ash, not all of it but enough, and placed it in a small tin that had once held boot polish. He could not have explained the impulse. He was not a sentimental man. He had served the Duke for 11 years, and had learned, in that time, that Lawrence Draycott destroyed only what mattered to him. The second letter came 2 days later. Your Grace, I walked in the garden this morning and met the head gardener, Mr. Weldon. He tells me the roses were planted by your grandmother. I thought you might like to know they are thriving. The pale ones along the south wall are particularly fine. I am learning the names of the household staff, and hope I am not making too great a nuisance of myself, Mrs. Ord has been very kind. This one he read twice, then burned. Penny swept the grate again. The letters continued through April and into May. They came every few days, sometimes every other day, short, careful observations written in that same steady hand. She told him about the weather, about a book she had found in the library, a collection of essays on landscape gardening that bore the inscription 2 AD, with affection on the flyleaf, written in a hand she did not recognize. She told him about a conversation she had overheard between two footmen arguing over the correct way to polish silver, which she had found amusing and thought he might as well. She told him the name of the cat that lived in the stables, a fat tortoiseshell called Marchioness, though she suspected the stable boys had invented the name for her benefit. She asked him nothing that required an answer, and yet every letter ended with a small question, as though she were leaving a door open that he might walk through if he chose. He never walked through. She did not know that he read them. She believed, because he never responded, never acknowledged, never once mentioned a single thing she had written, that the letters were collected by Penny and discarded unread. She imagined them accumulating in a pile somewhere, or thrown away with the morning's waste paper. She did not know that he stood at the window each time and read every word, his face perfectly still, his breathing perfectly even, and then held each one to the flame as though performing a small, precise surgery on himself. Penny kept every tin. He stored them in a wooden box beneath his bed, a box that had once held his mother's sewing things, the last object he possessed from his childhood in Hertfordshire. The ash of each letter lay in its own tin, undisturbed. He did not label them. He did not need to. He remembered the dates. By June, the letters grew shorter. Not colder. Ruth Sefton, who was now Ruth Draycott-in-law, if not in any other meaningful sense, did not have coldness in her, but briefer, as though she had begun to understand that she was writing into a silence that would not answer. The questions disappeared first. Then the observations grew spare. A line about the garden, a sentence about the light. The last letter she wrote before she stopped altogether was 4 lines long. Your Grace, the peonies have opened. They are the color of the inside of a shell. I thought of you when I saw them. I do not know why. He burned that one faster than the others. Penny noticed that the Duke's hand, when he held it to the flame, was not quite steady. The household noticed everything, of course. Mill. Ord, who had served as housekeeper at Halston Park since the old Duke's time, understood within the first fortnight that this marriage was not a marriage in any way that mattered. She had seen the young Duchess, barely 22, with brown hair that escaped its pins and a way of entering a room as though she expected to be asked to leave it, move through the house with increasing quietness as though she were learning to take up less space. Mrs. Ord had opinions about this. She kept them behind her teeth, where they sat like stones. The Duke was not cruel. This was the thing that made it worse. Cruelty could be confronted. Cruelty had edges, and edges could be gripped. Lawrence Draycott was simply absent, present in the house but never in the room, civil at dinner but never warm, correct in every duty and bankrupt in every human gesture. He had learned, somewhere in the years before this marriage, that to feel anything was to hand the world a blade and show it where to cut. His father, the fifth Duke, had been a man of extravagant feeling, extravagant rages, extravagant affections, extravagant disappointments that fell on his household like weather. Lawrence had survived that weather by becoming stone, and stone he remained. Ruth's letters were not a blade. They were an offering. But he could not tell the difference, and so he burned them. She stopped writing in July. By September, she had stopped coming to dinner unless guests required it. By November, she had spoken to Mrs. Ord about the possibility of spending the winter at her father's house in Devonshire, a modest estate outside Barnstaple, where the air smelled of damp wool and the valley was green even in December. Mrs. Ord brought the request to the Duke herself. She stood in his study with her hands clasped and her face betraying nothing and said, "Her Grace has asked whether she might visit her family for the season, Your Grace. She wished me to inquire whether you had any objection." He looked up from his papers. His face was calm. "I have none." Mrs. Ord waited. She waited for 5 full seconds, which was longer than she had ever waited for anything in this house. She was waiting for him to ask a question. How long or when or might she write? But the question did not come. She curtsied and left. Ruth departed on the 14th of December, in a carriage the Duke provided but did not accompany. She took 2 trunks, her writing case, and the brown leather volume of Cowper's poems that had belonged to her mother. She did not say goodbye to the Duke because the Duke was not at home when the carriage was loaded. He had gone riding at dawn and had not returned by noon. She left a note with Penny, not a letter, just a note, thanking the household for their kindness. Penny placed the note in the box beneath his bed. He did not put it in a tin. He left it as it was, folded once, her name signed at the bottom in that steady hand. She did not return. 1 year passed, then 2. She lived at her father's house in the rooms she had grown up in, with the same view of the valley and the same draught beneath the study door that her father, Sir Noel Sefton, had never troubled to fix. She read. She walked. She helped manage the household accounts, which her father had let deteriorate since her mother's death. She attended church on Sundays and called on neighbors on Tuesdays, and answered questions about the Duke with a composure so complete that people eventually stopped asking. The vicar's wife, Mrs. Leach, attempted once to draw her out on the subject over tea, and Ruth replied that the Duke was well, that she enjoyed the country air, and that the scones were excellent. Mrs. Leach understood the boundary and did not cross it again. She did not write to him, not once, and he did not write to her. What she did not know, what no one knew except Penny and Mrs. Ord and the silence of the house itself, was what happened at Halston Park in her absence. The Duke continued. He administered the estate. He sat in the House of Lords for the sessions that required his attendance, and spoke rarely but with precision when he did. He entertained when duty demanded it, and declined when it did not. He was seen at his club, at the correct dinners, at the autumn shoot at Helmsley. He was in every observable respect a man whose life was proceeding exactly as he intended. But Penny knew. Penny, who laid out the Duke's clothes each morning and attended him each evening and had learned to read his master the way a sailor reads the sky, knew that something had shifted. The Duke slept less. He rode longer, returning muddied and silent in the late afternoon. He stood at the east window of his study, the window that overlooked the garden, and beyond it, the south drive down which her carriage had disappeared, for minutes at a time, staring at nothing that Penny could see. Once, in the second winter after Ruth's departure, Penny entered the study to find the Duke holding a peony. dried, pressed flat, the color of the inside of a shell that had been kept between the pages of a book on the lower shelf. The Duke replaced it when he heard the door. Neither of them spoke. But Penny noticed that the book remained on the desk for 3 days afterward, untouched, before it was returned to the shelf. Penny added no new tins to the box, but he did not move it. And on certain evenings, when the house was quiet and the Duke had retired early with a glass of brandy he would not finish, Penny sat on the edge of his bed and placed one hand on the lid of the wooden box and felt the weight of what it contained. Not heavy, not in any physical sense, but present. 31 tins, 31 letters, 31 attempts by a young woman to reach a man who could not be reached, and who had punished himself for wanting to be. 5 years after Ruth's departure, Sir Noel Sefton died. The letter reached Halston Park on a Tuesday morning, among the usual correspondence. Penny brought it with the post. The Duke read it standing, as he read everything, and his hand trembled, a motion so slight that anyone other than Penny would have missed it entirely. "Send my condolences," the Duke said, "and have Bramley attend to any financial matters that require the estate's involvement. Sir Noel's daughter should not be troubled with solicitors at such a time." Sir Noel's daughter, not Ruth, not her Grace. Penny noted the distance in the phrasing and said nothing. 3 more years passed. Ruth remained at the house in Devonshire, which was now hers by her father's will, though the income was modest, and the roof required work she could not comfortably afford. She managed. She had always managed. She oversaw the small estate through the steward her father had employed, a steady man named Pillsworth, who deferred to her judgment in all things because her judgment was invariably correct. She kept the accounts herself now, a ledger in her father's study, the figures neat, the margins annotated in her steady hand. She was 32. The brown hair still escaped its pins, though there were threads of early gray at her temples that caught the light when she sat reading by the window. The steadiness in her hands had settled into something deeper, a steadiness of being, a composure that was not performance, but architecture, the structure of a woman who had learned to live inside silence without being diminished by it. She thought of the Duke rarely, and when she did, it was without anger. Anger required expectation, and she had learned to expect nothing from Lawrence Draycott. She had been his wife for 18 months and his absence for 10 years, and she could not have said which had taught her more. Then, in the spring of her 32nd year, a letter arrived from the solicitor in London. The Dowager Duchess of Halston, the Duke's mother, a woman Ruth had met only twice, both times briefly and neither time warmly, had died. The will contained a provision regarding a property in Somerset that had been part of the Dowager's personal holdings and which involved certain entailments touching upon the duchy. Ruth's presence was required at Halston Park to sign certain documents relating to the transfer. The solicitor regretted the inconvenience. The matter would take no more than 2 days. Ruth read the letter in her father's study, at the desk where she had once written notes to a man who burned them. She folded it along its crease. She set it aside. She looked out at the valley, green as it always was, even now, for a long time. Then she wrote to Mrs. Ord to say she would arrive on Thursday. The carriage brought her up the South Drive on a cold March afternoon, the kind of day when the light is thin and silver, and everything looks as though it has been washed. The house was the same, the stone, the windows, the gravel swept clean. The garden was the same, though the roses along the south wall had been cut back hard for winter, and the peonies were not yet in season. The front door opened, and Mrs. Ord stood there, older, grayer at the temples, her hands clasped in exactly the position they had occupied 10 years before. "Your Grace," Mrs. Ord said, and then more quietly, "Welcome home." Ruth did not correct her. It was not home, but she understood what Mrs. Ord meant by it, not the house, but the claim, the insistence that Ruth still had a place here regardless of what the Duke had done with it, and she was grateful. Penny was waiting in the entrance hall. He had aged more visibly than Mrs. Ord, his hair entirely white now, his movements slower, though his hands still carried that same surgical precision. He bowed. Ruth inclined her head. They had never exchanged more than a dozen words at a time in all the months she had lived here, but she had always understood that Penny observed things, that he registered what the rest of the household could not see or chose not to. "His Grace is in the study," Penny said. "He is aware of your arrival. He has asked that you be given the rooms in the East Wing." The East Wing. Not the bedchamber she had occupied before, the one that smelled of lavender and someone else's life. Ruth noted this without expression. "Thank you, Penny." He bowed again, and then, as she turned to follow Mrs. Ord toward the staircase, he spoke. "Your Grace." She stopped. His voice had changed, not louder but different in quality, as though something behind it had been released. Penny reached into his coat and withdrew a wooden box. It was small, perhaps a foot long, half as wide, and old, the wood dark with age and years of handling. He held it out to her with both hands, and his face was showing more expression than she had ever seen on it. Not emotion, precisely. Something closer to resolution. The look of a man setting down a weight he had carried for a decade and would not carry further. "I have kept these," he said. "I should like you to have them before you see His Grace." Ruth took the box. It was lighter than she expected, lighter than it should have been, given the way Penny had held it. She looked at him, and he held her gaze for a moment, the first time, she realized, that he had ever truly looked at her. And then he stepped back and clasped his hands behind him and became once again the silent figure she remembered. She carried the box to the east wing. She set it on the writing desk by the window, where the thin March light fell across its surface. She opened it. Inside were tins, small, round tins, the kind used for boot polish or snuff, arranged in neat rows. She opened the first one. Ash. She opened the second. Ash, fine, gray, soft as powder. She opened a third, a fourth, a fifth. Every tin held the same thing. Ash, packed carefully, undisturbed, each tin its own small reliquary. And beneath the tins, at the very bottom of the box, a folded note in her own handwriting, the note she had left with Penny on the day she departed. "Thank you for your kindness. R. Draycott." She understood. She sat at the writing desk with her hands on either side of the box, and she understood everything. Not all at once, not like a door opening, but like light entering a room through a crack that had always been there, and that she had mistaken for a seam in the wall. He had read them. Every letter, every small observation about the garden, the cat, the peonies, the weather, the footman, and the silver, he had read them all. And then he had burned them, because he could not bear to keep them, because keeping them would have meant admitting that they mattered, and admitting that they mattered would have meant admitting that she mattered, and that was the one thing Lawrence Draycott had spent his entire adult life refusing to do. And Penny, quiet, precise, unreadable Penny, had saved them anyway. Not the words were gone, but the evidence, the proof that they had existed, that she had written and he had read, and something had passed between them, even as it was being destroyed. Ruth sat with the box for a long time. The light moved across the floor, thin and silver. She did not cry. She had not cried about the Duke in years, and she did not intend to begin now, but her hands remained on the box, one on either side, as though she were holding something that might still, impossibly, be warm. At 4 o'clock, she stood. She closed the box. She carried it downstairs. The study door was closed. She knocked once and entered without waiting for a response, the first discourtesy she had ever committed in this house, and she found that she did not care. Lawrence Draycott was standing at the east window. He turned when the door opened, and she saw his face, 10 years older, thinner, the lines beside his mouth cut deeper, and she saw the moment he registered what she was carrying. His eyes moved to the box and stopped. The color left his face slowly, as though something were being withdrawn from beneath the surface. "Ruth," he said. It was the first time in 10 years that he had spoken her name, and his voice caught on it like cloth on a nail. She set the box on his desk. Between them. "Your valet," she said, "has kept the ashes of every letter I wrote to you." The Duke looked at the box. He did not touch it. "I know," he said, and then, more quietly, "I asked him to." The room went very still. The fire in the grate cracked once and settled. "You asked him to," Ruth repeated. "Not at first." The Duke's voice was controlled, but his hands were not. He placed them flat on the desk on either side of the box, mirroring her earlier posture without knowing it. "At first he did it of his own accord. I discovered them after you left, the second winter. I found the box beneath his bed when I went to his quarters regarding a matter with the household silver." "And you did not dismiss him?" "No." "And you did not destroy them?" "No." "And you did not write to me?" The silence that followed was the longest Ruth had ever inhabited. She stood on one side of the desk and he stood on the other, and the box of ash sat between them like a reliquary, like a catalogue of every word she had offered, and he had refused, and yet somehow, impossibly, preserved. "I could not," he said. "I did not know how to say what He stopped. She watched him stop. She watched the precise moment when the sentence exceeded what he was able to deliver, and she recognized it, the same careful destruction she had witnessed through closed doors and unanswered letters and a decade of silence. He was still burning things, still holding words to the flame because keeping them felt like a wound he could not survive. "You read them," she said. "Everyone. The one about the peonies." His jaw tightened. "Yes. I said I thought of you when I saw them. I said I did not know why." "I remember." "I knew why," Ruth said. "I knew precisely why I thought of you. I simply could not say it to a man who would not answer." He looked at her then, not at the box, not at the window, at her. And she saw in his face something she had never seen in the 18 months of their marriage. Not warmth, not yet, but the absence of the wall. The deliberate, exhausting, decade-long wall that he had built between himself and every living thing that tried to reach him. "I have no right to ask you to stay," he said. "No," Ruth agreed. "You do not. The documents require only a signature. You could leave tomorrow." "I could." He looked down at the box. He opened it. He lifted one of the tins, the first one, the letter about the roses in the garden and whether she was permitted to walk there, and held it in both hands. The ash shifted faintly inside, weightless. "You were always permitted," he said. "You were always permitted everything." I did not know how to say it without. He stopped again. Then, very quietly, "I was afraid that if I answered even one, I would not be able to stop." Ruth looked at him across the desk, across the ash of 31 letters and 10 years and 2 lives lived in parallel silence, and she made the decision she had come here to make without knowing she had come here to make it. "Then don't stop," she said. She did not leave the next day. She signed the documents in the solicitor's presence on Friday morning in the library with Mrs. Ord as witness and the Duke standing at the window pretending to read correspondence. And then she did not leave. She stayed through the weekend and through the following week and the week after that, and the distinction between visiting and remaining dissolved so gradually that no one could have named the precise day it ceased to exist. She moved from the east wing back to the rooms she had occupied before, the ones that smelled of lavender and beeswax, without announcement or ceremony. Mrs. Ord simply found the trunks relocated one morning and said nothing, though her hands, when she clasped them, were clasped more tightly than usual, and she stood in the corridor outside the bedchamber for a moment longer than duty required. The Duke did not become a different man overnight. He was still quiet, still controlled. Still a man who found the surface of things easier than the depth of them, who could administer an estate and sit in the House of Lords and speak with precision on matters of policy, but who faltered when the subject was his own heart. But he answered. When Ruth spoke to him at breakfast, he answered. When she left a note on the tray outside his study, a small note, nothing significant, a question about whether he would prefer lamb or beef at dinner, he wrote back. 2 words. Lamb. Thank you. She kept the reply. She placed it in the cedar box her mother had given her, alongside the dried sprig of rosemary from her father's garden and the ribbon from her wedding morning. It was the first letter she had ever received from him, and she handled it with the care of someone who understood exactly what it had cost. By summer, the peonies had opened again along the south wall. Ruth was in the garden on a Wednesday morning, kneeling beside the bed, not working the soil herself, but examining a bloom that Mr. Weldon had pointed out to her, a new variety that had seeded itself from the grandmother's original planting, when the Duke came to find her. Not by accident, not on his way to the stables or returning from a walk. He came deliberately, crossing the gravel path in his morning coat, his stride unhurried but purposeful, to stand beside her among the roses his grandmother had planted half a century before. He did not speak at first. He simply stood there, his shadow falling across the peony bed, his hands at his sides. Then he reached down and broke off a single bloom, pale, translucent, the color of the inside of a shell, and handed it to her. I pressed one, he said, after you left. I kept it in a book on the lower shelf. I know, Ruth said, though she had not known. She simply understood that of course he had, that this was what he did, burned what he could not bear to keep and kept what he could not bear to lose, and lived in the impossible space between. She took the peony. She held it the way she had once held his letters to the silver tray, with both hands, carefully, as though it were something that might be taken from her. It was not taken. Penny retired the following autumn, on a morning sharp with the first frost. The Duke provided him a cottage on the estate's western boundary, near the orchard, with a pension that was by any measure more generous than custom demanded. On his last morning of service, Ruth found him in the entrance hall, dressed in his own clothes for the first time in her memory, a dark wool coat, a clean collar, his white hair combed back from his forehead, and she pressed into his hands a pair of gloves lined with rabbit fur against the coming winter, and a note that read, "You kept what he could not. I am grateful beyond any word I might write, though I hope you know I would write them all." Penny looked at the note for a long time. His hands, those surgeon's hands, slower now, less certain, held the paper with the same care with which he had once held the tins. Then he folded it, placed it in his breast pocket, and bowed. Not the bow of a servant to a mistress, the bow of a man who had at last been understood. The box remained in the Duke's study, on the shelf beside the book where the pressed peony had lived. He did not hide it. He did not display it. It simply existed, a small wooden box containing the ash of every word his wife had written to him in the first year of a marriage he had nearly destroyed through the careful, methodical, terrified refusal to be reached. Years later, 2, 3, Ruth stopped counting and was glad to have stopped. She stood in the study doorway one evening and watched the Duke at his desk writing. Not correspondence. Not instructions for his steward or notes for the House of Lords. He was writing to her. She knew this because she could see the single sheet of paper and the careful, deliberate slowing of his hand, each word shaped as though it cost him something and he was willing, finally, to pay. He looked up and saw her in the doorway. He did not fold the letter. He did not reach for the candle. "For me?" she asked. "Yes. Will you burn it?" The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile, but the place where a smile lived now, closer to the surface than it had ever been. "No," he said, "not this one." She crossed the room and stood beside his chair, and he handed her the letter, still wet, the ink gleaming faintly in the candlelight. She read it there, standing at his shoulder, while the fire burned quietly in the grate, and the ash of older, earlier words sat undisturbed in their tins on the shelf above them. What the letter said belonged to them. But Mrs. Ord, who passed the open study door that evening on her way to check the silver, saw the Duchess standing at the Duke's shoulder with a sheet of paper in her hands, and the Duke looking up at her with an expression that Mrs. Ord had never once seen on his face in 30 years of service. She did not pause. She did not comment. She continued down the corridor with her keys at her waist and her opinions, for once, entirely at rest. In the late spring of the following year, their son was born, not in the garden, though Ruth would later say she wished it had been, because the peonies were in full bloom and the light through the bedchamber windows came in the color of warm honey. They called him Noel, after her father, and the Duke held him in the study on his first morning with the same precise, deliberate care with which he had once held her letters to the flame, except that this time his hands did not let go. The box of ash remained on the shelf. Sometimes Ruth opened it. Sometimes she lifted a tin and held it, and thought of the girl who had sat at a dressing table that smelled of lavender, writing words into a silence she believed was empty, not knowing that a man stood at a window each morning and read every one, and answered with fire, because he did not know how to answer with anything else. She did not mourn those letters. The words were gone. But what they had built, the slow, patient, 10-year proof that she had tried, and that he had heard, and that someone who stood between them had loved them both enough to save the evidence, that remained. That would remain. Penny came to the house each Christmas. He sat in the kitchen with Mrs. Ord and drank tea from the cup that had been set aside for him, and held young Noel on his knee with hands that no longer moved like a surgeon's, but still moved with care. The Duke came down to the kitchen once, an unprecedented breach of the household's geography that left 2 footmen frozen mid-task and a scullery maid staring, and stood in the doorway and looked at his former valet holding his son, and at the cup of tea, and at Mrs. Ord's face, which was attempting composure and not entirely succeeding. "Thank you, Penny," the Duke said, "for your years of service." Penny inclined his head. "It was never a burden, Your Grace." The Duke held his gaze for a moment. Then he nodded once and returned upstairs. But Ruth, who had followed him to the kitchen doorway without his knowing, saw him pause on the stairs. She saw him place one hand on the banister and stand very still for a long moment, his head bowed, his shoulders carrying something that was not weight but its opposite, the strange, unfamiliar lightness of a man who had finally stopped burning what he loved. They arrive here, like ash gathered and kept against all reason, whenever they are ready.